Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this very special session at Reset. This is the first time that the presidents of the Advertising Association, the IPA and ISBA have come together to address really some very key issues facing the industry, namely the economic recovery, inclusion, and the climate emergency. I'm Aasmah Mir, a presenter at Times Radio, and I'm delighted to be joined by Keith Weed, CBE, President of the Advertising Association, by Nigel Vaz, President of the IPA and the Global CEO of Publicis Sapient, and Peter Duffy, President of ISBA and Chief Executive of Money Supermarket. Good morning to all of you. Welcome.
Good morning.
Morning.
You're all sounding very healthy, which is good to hear. Now, at the end of this session, we'll have the opportunity for a short audience Q&A. So please do post your questions via the box to the right of the screen, and we will try to cover as many as possible. So let's kick off. We don't have a huge amount of time. I would like to start with an opening question to each of you. Now, the latest reports from the IPA and the AA, the WARC, that's a lot of letters, show just how much of an economic impact coronavirus has had on our industry. That's no surprise. With forecasts now showing that there's unlikely to be a return to pre-COVID levels of spend until 2023. So how should the industry respond to this? Keith, what do you think?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the decline has not been as bad as we feared. So let's also look at some of the positive thoughts about momentum. So the advertising industry declined by 7.9% last year in the UK. And compared to the US or Europe, that's significantly better. So it was a 10% decline in the US and nearly a 14% decline in Europe. And looking forward to this year, we're actually seeing in the UK an estimate of a bigger growth, a bigger recovery, so 15% growth for the UK, which again is much better than the US at around 4%, or indeed much better than the growth of Europe, which is about 9%. So we've got some positive signs. But as I said, as we went into this crisis last year, the advertising industry is very much the canary in the mine. We get hit first. You know, when a business is in crisis, the first thing they worry about is their people. The second thing they worry about is cutting budgets to make sure they survive. And indeed, the advertising budgets were cut. So I think what the industry needs to focus on is the role of growth and how advertising can stimulate growth, and we can grow back stronger as consumers come back into the market.
Nigel, what do you think? Should we focus on growth, or are you concerned?
No, I think as Keith said, you know, if you look at the IPA bellwether report for Q4 was down, but a lot less steeply down than the previous two quarters. And of course, we know this is because of the pandemic, but also because of the uncertainty that is in front of us, you know, as businesses think about the cost of Brexit, right? Both of these issues are kind of there at the same time. From our perspective, you know, our belief is that you have to maintain a share of voice in weathering any downturn. And previous research has shown over decades that basically the brands that do will be the ones that consumers stay most with through thick and thin. But then I also feel like this is a pretty unique time in the journey that all consumer and brand relationships are going through. So how do actually, you know, brands think about really reimagining how they create these relationships and connections with? So whether it's direct to consumer relationships, moving more towards digital channels like commerce, whether it's thinking about the role of experience in the context of the propositions that they're putting out to customers, I think these kinds of shifting patterns and behaviors is going to be critical.
Peter, how do you think the industry should respond?
Well, I think it's going to be a moment when the industry is needed more than ever. If you look at the last 12 months, I think it's been a bit of a mix. Some companies have clearly done very well, but of course, many companies have really struggled. And as Keith kind of pointed out, not only have they cut costs, but in some cases, they've really tried to preserve cash. I think if you look at the macro, many organizations have avoided giving guidance, because listed organizations particularly, because it's just so unclear what that's looking like. I think over the next 6 to 12 months, that will begin to shift, and there'll be a clamour from markets to begin to understand what the revenue picture looks like. And I think you'll begin to see revenue initiatives really, you know, coming to the fore again in many, many organizations. And of course, I think that then means that marketing will become back in centre. And I think for marketeers, what that means and what's particularly challenging is that the spend which has come out of the industry that will inevitably come back in, I think it's just going to be analysed in a way that it's been never analysed before. We're going to have to really demonstrate that that incremental spend is going to drive return for shareholders. And it's actually going to do what shareholders want, which is to begin to significantly drive revenue and begin to excite customers to buy products that they haven't been for a period of time. So measurement is going to be something which is more critical than it has been in the past.
That's very interesting. Let's move on and talk about the issue of inclusion and diversity. I know it's something that your industry wants to address. So let's start by asking what you are all going to do about it this year. Keith?
Well, I think for our industry, diversity is more important than many, because the very core of what we do is creativity and innovation. And you can take a group of very similar people and put them in a room and try and teach them or train them to think and act more diverse. Or, of course, you can start off with a group of diverse people and use that as a springboard for creativity. So I think the very lifeblood of this industry is based on having diverse thinking and diverse styles, which will be, of course, made so much easier with diverse people. So what are we going to do? I think one thing actually we're doing along with ISBA and IPA, so my two colleagues here, we're going to do a census. On the principle of measure what you treasure, and really have a plan based on data and fact. We need to understand better where we are, like a dipstick that we can then come back to later and measure progress. And what gets measured gets done in all businesses, and it's true for us as well. So it's called All In, March the 10th, mark it in your diary. You can go onto the AA website, for example, and register, and then vote. And across the industry, but the AA, IPA, ISBA, we're really going to champion good quality data to ensure that we can really tackle this objective with a plan based on data and understanding and insight.
So, Nigel, once we have that data, what do you do with it? What actually will happen? What will change?
I think this is really a good question, Aasmah, because when you think about inclusion, diversity, as you said, right, and Keith was talking just now, we have to understand a benchmark of where we are. But one of the things that we've also got to start to do is actually start to, as you said, start to think about how we actually use that data to start to shift things. One of the things the IPA did this year was create, actually was in 2020 now, the I-List, which effectively announces 30 people who've made a real game-changing personal impact to improve the diversity and inclusivity of the industry in the context of the agencies. Things like Creative Pioneers, which were apprenticeships, and Advertising Unlocked, which were all about how we attract new and diverse talent into the industry on the basis of the data that we're seeing. Because interestingly enough, while this is the first survey that's happening across all the three bodies that are represented here, the IPA's annual census has been going on since kind of 1960. And frankly, one of the things I think we've had to have learned through that is, whilst the data was telling us what we already knew, which is the industry needs to be more diverse and reflective of the people we serve, we were not moving fast enough on whether it was age, gender, ethnic diversity, or indeed, functional diversity. So thinking about who are the people who actually lead this industry and what are their perspectives and backgrounds. Are they creative people, or are they technology people? And as our industry starts to shift, bringing these new perspectives in also from a diversity perspective becomes critical. So I think some of these initiatives that were individual institution specific can hopefully now start to actually become pan-industry in a truly pan-industry sense, with the representation we have here beginning with this conference.
It's interesting, Peter, because it's kind of the same it's a similar argument or discussion that's being had right now in relation to the BBC, and that's about the people who are selling the stuff and the people who are making the stuff, the people who are coming up with the ideas. Is it important that both sides of that equation are diverse and inclusive, or is one more important than the other? What do you think?
No, it's important that both sides are. To start, ISBA are clearly going to be supporting the inclusion audit that Keith describes. But I think this is for every organisation, whether they be a company, a media agency, a media owner, to begin to look at what they can then begin to do individually. If I just talk about my own organisation, Money Supermarket Group, for example, we've just spent the last 3 months, as many organisations have, just trying to understand the profile of our people. And we've done a sort of ethnicity audit, essentially, to begin to understand what we look like. And what a surprise, we find that we don't look like the customers we serve. We actually don't look like the markets we hire out of. We've got a real issue we need to begin to address. So I think this has to become a year of action where it's not about words, it's become about what we're going to do. So as an example, in my own organisation, we've just completed an ethnicity pay audit to make sure that we have no equal pay issues. We had to rebalance some salaries. In a couple of cases, broadly, we were okay, but there was work that needed to be done. I think it's the year where you have to look at, we've just done a microaggression audit. We're obviously doing lots on education, which is sort of fundamental. But I think this is a year where we're going to really have to look at how we begin to hire. And I think that is the biggest issue. How do we begin to train our hiring people so there's no hidden bias? How do we look at issues like blind hiring? But how do we start to begin to change the culture overall? So we're not just hiring against the role, but we're hiring for the team. We're hiring for the sorts of organizations we want to become tomorrow. And as a consequence, we think then more broadly about what we're looking for in candidates, so we can begin to actually make the necessary change we need to, rather than find excuses that we just didn't have, the sorts of candidates in the mix that we wanted to. I think this has to become about actions in 2021 over words.
Keith, let me ask you, because I started with you, about what you see as the benefit of greater inclusion and diversity in the industry. I mean, it may seem obvious, but what do you see it as, and does it have to continue to be spelled out, do you think?
I think we need to keep making the point, because at the end of the day, this issue has been around for a long time, and we've been discussing it for a long time. And while we're making progress, I couldn't agree more than Peter. It needs to be about action. And certainly when I was working at Unilever, one of the things that I found hugely helpful, coming back to Peter's point about hiring, was this notion of a balanced slate. That at the end of the day, you need to pick the best person for the job. No one would challenge that. But if at the end of the day you have, I don't know, 5 white guys on the shortlist, you're going to choose a white guy. If you have a shortlist that has a balanced slate of people from different backgrounds, then the best person out of that balanced slate should be chosen, and then whoever that might be, that person gets the job. So I think we need to carry on putting a spotlight on this, and I do really think that we can use this year as a step up. We've got some momentum. I think the census, 10th of March, if everyone can get behind that around the thought of all in, so please use social handles and the like to get more people included, because it really is only going to be worth it if we get broad industry buy-in to doing the census. The data is going to be handled, of course, with GDPR and run by Kantar. So I think we are in a good place to make some real action, but we have to now make real action, and the industry will benefit. Well, actually, we'll all benefit, but the industry will benefit through greater creativity.
Let's move on and talk about the theme of climate action. Keith, come back to you again. Advertising has been highlighted by Extinction Rebellion and by some within your own industry as part of the problem, not the solution when it comes to tackling the climate emergency. Do you think that's fair? And what changes do you think we need to see in the industry in regards to climate action?
Well, I'm for everyone highlighting the challenges we have around climate. We have a real crisis. So the more people that shine a spotlight on what we're doing as humankind, but also what we're doing in business, the better. Because clearly we're not making the progress we need to make, and we need to make more progress, and we need to do that urgently. I think advertising can be challenged, as did the whole of the consumer industry in the sort of 80s get into selling more stuff. I think that's a fair debate to be had. I think you have to remember, though, at the end of the day, advertising is the voice piece of brands. So I think where we need to start, and where I did a huge amount of work on brands with purpose at Unilever, and I led the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, generating real evidence that this can grow brands and can connect you with new consumers. So I think let's work out what the brand agenda needs to be. And of course, advertising then could be a tremendous accelerator of behavior change. If you think about the role of advertising over the decades, from getting people from hand washing laundry to machine washing, or brushing their teeth twice a day, or wearing seatbelts, or more recently staying at home and washing clothes, and washing hands. All these are important behavioral changes which have been helped by communicating and engaging people. So I see the role of advertising going forward as how can you really get people to change their behavior in this area. Now, the industry itself, of course, is addressing its own approach. We have Ad Net Zero, where we're looking at how we get to a genuine carbon net zero by 2030, whole action plan behind that. And if anyone wants to learn more, go onto the AA website, and you can see around Ad Net Zero the 5 actions about reducing emissions. But one is the industry absolutely needs to do the right thing. But let's look at how the advertising creativity can accelerate what we need, and that is mass engagement and mass adoption of sustainable living, and promote sustainable lifestyles.
Let's move on and talk about transparency now, Peter, because I know that you're interested in this. I understand that, transparency has been a major theme for the industry in recent years. I wonder, what do you mean by transparency, and what is the problem that the lack of transparency creates?
So I think I point to 3 main areas, really. The first is the client-agency relationship, and probably I'm talking about the client-media agency relationship in the main. Because in any good relationship, it starts with trust. And if you want that relationship to be sustainable, you need to make sure that trust kind of exists. And both parties need to understand that they're aligned. And I guess if interests aren't absolutely aligned, then there is then the potential for conflict kind of going forward. So you just need that transparency to begin to understand that. So I think for a client and media agency, that really does begin with the contract that they have, really. How can the client actually understand exactly how the whole thing is set up? Because you're always going to get clients who are going to focus on just the cheapest media, for example. But I think increasingly, you're going to see more and more clients who want to understand that their own business performance is actually the key driver for the media agency's success. They want to see that very direct linkage. And of course, that's got to start with information and understanding. What are the choices that are available? Who's buying what from whom? Who's marking what up? What's their incentive in proposing one route versus another? So clients only really have a choice when they understand all of that, and they understand all of that very transparently. So ISBA helps there with the media services framework, but I think that would be my number one. And number two is education. Clients don't always understand how this stuff works. They have lots of other things that they need to begin to do. So if I point to the work like the Programmatic Supply Chain Transparency Study that PwC did with ISBA, I think that was just tremendously useful for opening the industry's eyes to the fact that standardization is sort of urgently required across all contractual and technological areas of part of our business like that. So the fact that we're now working together is kind of really great, but we really, really need that pressure. I think the third point I would point to is measurement. And it comes back to what I was saying at the start. As money goes back into the industry, clients are really going to need to be able to demonstrate that it is driving the return that it needs to. For many CMOs, it's the number one priority. And that's absolutely why ISBA is kind of driving Origin, because as advertisers, we need to be able to plan, to report, to evaluate media, and we need to demonstrate that we're improving the efficiency and effectiveness of it. And to be frank, it's just medieval that as an industry, we are not able to do that in a comparative way today. So that is why Origin as a program is so important to enable advertisers to begin to do that. It's really great that, as well as the sort of progressive media agencies and media owners who are getting behind it, we've now got 30 clients who are directly funding this. So 7 out of 10 of the UK's biggest advertisers are funding it directly. And I think what we're going to see with the trials which will roll out this year is something which is just a step forward in being able to help us on the client side demonstrate to our shareholders that marketing really, really does drive a return. So they're the 3 areas. So number 1, the contract; number 2, education; and number 3, just being able to measure and to demonstrate the return on what we do.
Okay, that's fascinating stuff. Let's try and get some questions now, because people have been posting them as I asked them to. So it would be rude not to ask the questions. Let's try and rattle through them, shall we, first of all. Nigel, I'm going to put this one to you. I mean, it's also on climate change. Bearing in mind that 81% of the UK population, says Jake, think we are in a climate emergency, and that the UK hosts COP26 this year, of course, in Glasgow. When we talk about growth, shouldn't we be talking about net zero growth or growth aligned to the Paris Climate Agreement? Nigel, what do you think?
I think it's a great question, because I feel like unless we have support of business more broadly to these commitments, and this conversation's been going on in Davos this week, it's absolutely clear that governments alone won't be able to make the shift. And so from my perspective, actually ensuring that every single company is thinking about the context of their growth, like Keith described with the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, in the context of how that growth is achieved sustainably. I just don't see us actually making progress towards the broader agreements, because the challenge that you have with legislation coming down into companies is they firstly take time to roll out, but secondly, they often always aren't learning from the grassroots movements that companies can actually stimulate themselves to start to educate what that regulation ought to be. Because what we've seen oftentimes is regulation lags the actual earnest progress being made by companies like Unilever and others who've actually been pioneers in how to actually move towards those goals. So I think to kind of Jake's question, I'm a huge proponent of the fact that business is being aligned to these ideas, but more importantly, being people that provide solutions as opposed to simply adhere to regulations is definitely the way to go.
Okay. There's a question from Mike. Do you think, and Keith, I'll put this to you, do you think the agency pricing model will need to change from one of input, i.e. time and fees, to one of output or outcome as clients respond to the quicker, faster, cheaper point?
Yes. A longer answer.
Good.
Look,
No, that's fine.
At the end of the day, we're consuming more content than ever before. And if you look at the big behavior changes of consumers last year in lockdown and into this lockdown, what are some of the big things that are changing? Well, e-commerce, that's a massive shift, but also the way we're viewing content. We're viewing a lot more content, and we're viewing it in different places. And to produce that, there's a sort of a thought about in production of content that you've got sort of three things: quality, speed, and cost, and you can choose two of the three. And I don't think that's true. We have to choose three of the three, and in doing so, we have to reinvent how we produce different content at different pricing to ensure that it's fit for business. So of course, your massive explosion film on cinema, you're going to have a different quality than maybe a video post you're doing on Instagram. And we need to rethink how we do that, and absolutely about outcomes and output, and not about input. Agree.
Okay. Peter, here's a question that you might be interested in. It's from Mark. Post-lockdown, eventually we're going to get there. What are your thoughts on the marketing emphasis on short-termism performance versus long-term brand building?
Well, I think I'll just answer that in saying it's going to be about revenue, and I tap into what I said at the start. Shareholders are once again going to want to understand who are the structural winners out of the pandemic. Who are the businesses which are going to be performing tomorrow? Who are the businesses which are essentially legacy and losers as a result of all of this? So they're going to want to understand results. And I don't think actually short versus long term is going to be the immediate issue. I think what people are going to want to understand is, what does that 2-3 year revenue plan look like in the context of the environment that we're coming into? And how can firms clearly execute against that and deliver against the promises they're making? It will be a combination tomorrow as it has been today.
This idea of kind of recruitment, which feeds into diversity and inclusion, is very interesting. Paul has sent in a question. In the media industry, we have in the past most often recruited university graduates. Through the lens of inclusivity, how do we bring in more people to the industry who have not or have been unable to get access to university education? Keith, I'll come to you in a second, but Nigel, I'll be interested to hear what you think about that.
I think that's what, I think you have to start by, tuning into the discussion that's actually happening with university education more generally, right? Are universities preparing young people for roles in organizations like the kinds we all work in, right? Are there apprenticeships? Are there other ways to get in? But I feel like just broadly on this discussion, we have to move from this notion of unconscious bias, right? Whether it's how you get a job, or how you get into university, or how indeed you actually get into an industry or sector, and move to the conversation from from unintended or unintended consequences and unintended bias to conscious inclusion. How do we actually include the people we want to include, which make us more reflective of the people that we serve? Because if society is more diverse and the people serving that society in the context of what they consume in advertising or content or technology aren't reflective of those people, then there's something wrong with the model. And if universities can't deliver the kind of people we need, we have to find new ways to engage these folks, whether it's apprentices or the Creative Pioneers program I mentioned, other ways. But I think focusing on the outcome we want, which is we have to reflect the society we serve, is probably more important than focusing on the things we do. And I think as long as we achieve the outcome, everything is fair game.
Okay, now we only have a couple of minutes left. Keith, very briefly on that, because there's a cracking question on disinformation that I'd really like to ask all of you. So Keith, just quickly on the recruitment side of things.
Okay, so I would agree that we need to find new career paths. If you go back to some of the advertising greats, they started in the mailroom of the agency or whatever. So I do think we've got locked into a sort of a graduate recruitment scheme type approach, and you need to work out how we get different perspectives and ideas in. Otherwise, we end up producing advertising caught in Adland, and the Unstereotype Alliance is a perfect example of trying to change exactly that sort of thinking from UN Women to try and get a different approach in how we represent society in advertising and shifting norms accordingly. And that's going to require different people producing the ads.
So as I said, this question, Russ says, what specifically are your organizations actively doing to combat the spread of misinformation, disinformation, and hate content online? Peter?
So quite a lot. We have Money Saving Expert as part of our portfolio, and a big part of that is its chat room, which is there to simply answer questions customers have about financial issues that they see every day. And actually, it's a place where they can begin to check in and to find out if what they are reading online is correct, and actually get unbiased and independent advice. And that is a very significant part of our portfolio. We think that our business will only be successful if customers can trust us and they can actually understand exactly what it is that they're buying. So it's a very, very big part of what we do.
Nigel, what about you? What are you doing to combat this?
I think in the context of the IPA specifically, one of the things we recognize is we have to have technological solutions that are industry specific, not just platform specific. So you can't just have the people who run the platforms provide the technology to safeguard the platform. So we're doing a lot of work on things like blockchain, and we have a pilot running right now to start to ensure that advertising and media dollars don't end up, on content that isn't appropriate, either in the context of child safety or in the context of the positioning of the brand. And as we start to develop technological solutions, I think that's the only way you start to get at misinformation and disinformation at scale. Because I feel like right now we're too reliant on the very platforms that promote these ideas in the way that they have been designed to police them on our behalf. And I think we need to start to look at it as having technological solutions on behalf of clients. And the IPA is kind of definitely taking the lead in that.
Okay, I think we've only got time for one more question. There's so many of them. Thank you so much for being so enthusiastic and sending in your questions. This is directed to you, Peter. Do you think, it's from Andrew, do you think it would avoid a conflict of interest if media agencies stopped reselling media to their clients?
Well, Andrew, you hit the heart of the issue. I don't think it's a question of necessarily reselling, but it's just making it very transparent and very clear with clients what's happening. And I think you then put the choice in the client's hands as to whether they want to participate in that model or whether they want to do something different. So it's just about making it very, very open and transparent about what's happening and what the deal is.
And we touched on this earlier, but let's ask you again. This is from Tobit. What do you think agencies' role is or could be in driving sustainability? We've touched on this already, but how would you summarize this, Keith?
Well, I think it's quite simply is to let the brand tell its story, and to make sure that we find new ways of finding more purposeful approaches to our brands, and this is exactly what consumers want and are looking for. And if you look at some of the great brands of the last decade, those that have really added to society, both in environmental sustainability and social sustainability, have made a real impact. And this is what people are looking for even more as we come out of the current challenges. So I think the role that advertising can play is to be a challenger back to the advertisers, and try and encourage them to be bolder in this area. But then when they get a brief around a brand, is to find ways to really help from all different approaches around promoting sustainable lifestyles. For example, if you think of seeing an ad being shot in a kitchen, we all have recyclable bins in our kitchens, but do you see recyclable bins in ads? Often not. So I think we've got to start thinking about what are the things that we want to promote in society, and ensure that these are involved in the advertising that we produce. Because at the end of the day, advertising can have a critical role in building sort of new futures and a more sustainable lifestyle.
That's a fantastic point about the bin. I feel that my recycling bin needs a starring role in life as well. Thank you so much for that. I hope that was fun for you guys, and I hope that it was interesting and illuminating for everyone watching at home in their pajamas. So thank you to Keith Weed, to Nigel Vaz, and to Peter Duffy, and thank you as well for joining us.